Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to another episode of Dub Business Talk. I have a very, very special guest, Kishore Mahbubani. He is the author of Has China Won, along with many other books. He is also a veteran diplomat and a former president of the UN Security Council. He is an expert of the rise of Asia. Hello, Kishore Mahbubani, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I would like to welcome my DUB editor, Brigitte Zypris. Brigitte has around 20 years of government experience. Most recently, she was Federal Minister of Economics. Hello, Brigitte. Mike, we can't hear you, but I think you told us something. And today, the 65th DUB business call is taking place with the topic, Has China Won? We have taken over the title from Kishore Mahbubani's bestseller. Today, we will talk about his book and the US-China relations. So let's start with the interview. Kishore, I have your book too. I've read it during my vacation. And after the last page, I got.
I hope we didn't spoil your vacation.
But I sent it to you to sign it.
Yeah. Okay. Please, I'm happy to sign it. Okay. Number 801.
No, I send you more than that.
Okay.
And after the last page, I got the feeling that China has won the economic war against the USA. Why is the race not over yet?
No, I think it's far too early to say that China has won. I mean, this is really the beginnings of a major geopolitical contest between the United States and China. So I think we're just seeing the opening rounds. But as I try to explain in my book, it's got deeper roots and will carry on for a while. And for almost 2,000 years plus, no number one power ever gives up its power voluntarily, except maybe the United Kingdom to the United States in the 19th century. But now I think it's just the beginning. So, but the goal, my goal in writing the book actually paradoxically was to try and help the United States, because behind the question, has China won, there lies a more important question, which is, can America lose? And if you talk to Americans, and I do all the time, the idea of America losing is impossible. How can America lose? America has won every geopolitical contest. World War I, it defeated Germany. World War II defeated Germany and Japan. It faced off the economic challenge from Japan. It defeated the Soviet Union. So America only wins. America never loses. But this time around, the United States is dealing with a country with 4 times the population and a 4,000-year history. It's different. It's of a different magnitude. And also, the determination of the Chinese people is amazing. They suffered for 100 years. And I described the century of humiliation. The Chinese really suffered enormously for 100 years. So, when you suffer a lot, you get a lot of determination. Whereas by contrast, the United States has just got used to victory after victory after victory. And the biggest strategic mistake that the Americans are making is to think that victories are automatic. Losses never happen. But the Chinese, on the other hand, think, hey, we may lose, we can lose. Let's take this seriously. And so at the end of the day, my book is actually an effort to warn my American friends. And why don't you start thinking strategically before you launch this contest? And that's why I quote my one-on-one lunch with Henry Kissinger, where he said to me, and he allowed me to quote him by saying, the biggest problem is that America doesn't have a strategy to deal with China. And that's shocking.
How were the first reaction on your book from China and from the US? You got love mails, or somebody sent you something special?
Well, anyone who looks at the title would assume that China would welcome the book and America would not welcome the book. That will be the logical response.
Yeah.
But number one, China has not welcomed the book because I tried. My publisher has tried. It cannot be published in China.
You can't be?
No, it cannot be published because it's got too many criticisms of China. Despite its title, it makes some points which are politically unacceptable in China to say. And so, but by contrast, I would say among the more thoughtful American friends or pro-American friends of mine who have read it, I'll give you two examples, okay? And I'm allowed to cite them. One is Martin Wolf, I think of the Financial Times. Immediately after he read it, he sent me an email saying it was excellent. So I said, oh, Martin, I came back, I said, I hope you don't mind if I become cheeky. Since you say it's excellent, would you mind giving me a blurb? Oh, he gave me a wonderful blurb. Wonderful, And then Farid Zakaria, who I think is now probably in the top league of American strategic thinkers, he told me is excellent, and then he made it the book of the week on his weekly global GPS Global Public Square show. So I mean, the more thoughtful Americans who have read it, and there are a few others, but to be fair, I won't name them because I don't have their permission. But these two, I have their permission. Have come back to me and say they really like the book, And for some of them, I can tell you that when I try to describe how America has become functionally a plutocracy, they say, wow, actually you're right, there's something fundamentally gone wrong here in the United States. So they agree with the criticisms that I have made. And they also agree that it's a mistake for United States to underestimate China and also demonize China. Both are counterproductive.
Brigitte, when you were in the government, how did you experience, what experience did you have with China?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting book, Mr. Mahbubani. I think the idea you mentioned to say that China changed a lot is quite right. That people suffered and now they have got more wealthy, they've got more money, they have the opportunity to build out what we call a middle class. This really is a very good experience for people in China. But also I think that in the last, let's say 20 years or 15 years, with the upcoming internet and the opportunity to look after the people with the internet, social control by the net, however you call it, things changed again. When I started to be a Minister of Justice in 2002, we had these regular meeting with the Chinese on the rule of law, and we tried to implement what we call rule of law in a state. And it was always a fruitful discussion, and the Chinese were open to think about implementing law, make it possible that death penalty, for instance, was looked after once again, and that people get more rights if the states wants to take their houses to build new skyscrapers and all these stuff of things. So we did quite a bit of discussion, and the things changed. But as I mentioned in the last 10, 15 years, it took the other direction in China again. So we do not talk about more rule of law. We talk about more power for the state. And this is something I really looking thoughtful on it.
Kishan?
Just a quick comment on that. By the way, you're right. There is no doubt that 10, 15 years ago, and that's one of the reasons why my book is not welcome in China, is that I say what happened in China, the reason why corruption, for example, grew in China was precisely because the center became weak. Essentially, what I was saying is that China went through a period where it didn't have a strong leader. And so there were two political monsters emerge in China. One was, of course, corruption, and the other was factionalism. And that's why you had the attempt by Zhou Yonggang and Bo Xilai to overturn the decision of the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Chinese realized that that period of weakness was a very dangerous one. And of course, you're not supposed to talk about it, by the way. It's taboo to talk about it, but I talk about it in my book. But of course, in that period, because the center was weak, there was also more freedom. The more freedom for people to speak openly and explore ideas and so on and so forth. But of course, now there's no doubt that under President Xi Jinping, things have become much tougher, much more disciplined. But at the same time, I don't know whether you've seen the study that just came out after my book. In fact, it just came out in July or August by the Harvard Kennedy School. And they did consistent surveys in China over a 3-year period. And they begin the report by saying that Western theory says that when you have strong authoritarian rule, what you should see is disillusionment with the authoritarian rule. People will turn away against it, and regime support should go down. This should be the normal trend, go down. It's in China, on the basis of surveys, is going up. Today, the support for the Chinese Communist Party is the highest it's ever been. So there's something clearly the Chinese Communist Party is doing in winning the support of its people. And this is Harvard Kennedy School, and by the way, it's confirmed by others, the Edelman Trust Barometer, and so on and so forth. But but going back to the rule of law issue, I think it'd be difficult for China to implement 100% of what you have in the West. So for example, the big difference, as you know, between China and the West is that in the West, the law is above everybody. So even the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, is below the law. In China, as you know, it's not rule of law, it's rule by law. Yeah. And so the top leaders are above the law. And that's part of almost like Chinese culture, you know. But that's for the top people. But for the people at the middle, actually, and for people at the bottom, and I want to emphasize especially the bottom, because whenever we talk in such discussions, unfortunately, what we do is we focus on the top 10%, the elites. But if you read John Rawls, the American political philosopher, what you should focus on is the bottom 10%. And from the bottom 10%, in fact, the bottom 50% of China, for most of Chinese history, the biggest problem they have is chaos, absolute chaos, and no protection, no rights at all, no protection. Someone can come and seize your property and take it away, and it's all by rule by might. But what has happened in China is that for the bottom 50%, there is greater rule of law. And in my book, I don't know if you remember, I describe a conversation I had with an American guy who spent 10 years advising judges in China. And he said to me, Kishore, I was, number one, very impressed by the quality of mind of these judges I dealt with in China. Then he said, one day I said to them, you know, why do you still have the death penalty? Why don't you just preserve the death penalty? You mentioned death penalty. Why don't you preserve the death penalty only for the most severe crimes like murder and not have it for other things? And he said to me, Kishore, this Chinese judge gave me a wise reply. The Chinese judge said, if we follow you, then what will happen is that we will only hang poor people. We will not hang rich people. Okay. We want to have a society where you hang the poor and the rich. And that in some ways is more just, right? I mean, you can of course have your views as to whether or not death penalty is right or wrong, but that is a separate matter. But the question is, how do you implement your laws And how do you make sure? And as you know, in the United States of America, it's even though they have the rule of law, it's also very clear that if you have a lot of money, guess what?
Yeah.
You will get a pardon, right? Money can buy you, help you escape from the rule of law in the United States. So let's also be very clear about that. I can tell you last night, I had a very shocking conversation with a friend of mine, a very successful woman in New York. And she said to me, Kishore, we now live in terror. Exactly the word she used. Huh? We live in terror. President Trump will not accept the results of the elections. If it's a close win by Biden, there will be a civil war and we cannot stop it. No. Can you imagine? And then when she described what the United States is doing with the Postal Service, I said, that's what happens in a banana republic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you compare what you see in China in terms of rule of law with what's happening in the United States, I would say don't compare on the basis of theory, compare on the basis of practice. And especially for the bottom 50%, the bottom 50% in the United States, the bottom 50% in China. And then you'll see how much the conditions in many ways have improved for the bottom 50% in China and sadly deteriorated for the bottom 50% in the United States. And I haven't even given you the statistics on what percentage of the American population, especially the percentage of the American Black population who are in jail.
Wow, that's very tough, and I hope it will come in another way. You finished your book just before the pandemic, right? And what has happened then? What do you think is, does Corona help China to get closer to the victory?
Well, I mean, let me emphasize one thing. Huh? The battle against COVID-19 is not over. We are still in the thick of battle. And as you know, there's an old saying, if you're in the thick of battle, you're surrounded by the fog of war. Yeah. And when you're surrounded by the fog of war, it's a big mistake to say who will be the winner, who will be the loser. So for example, it's conceivable, since the United States has the best universities, the best scientific research institutes in the world, that the United States may come out with some miracle vaccine or miracle cure, and the whole world would cheer and say, thank God we have America. America saved us again. And that could happen, and that would be a huge coup for United States of America. It would certainly help to boost America's standing in the world dramatically, and it would show that in many critical ways, the United States is still ahead of China. But that depends on the final outcome. But as of now, there is absolutely no doubt that China is handling COVID-19 much better than United States. And just if you look at one statistic, the number of deaths per million from COVID-19, in China, it's less than 10. I don't know the figure, 5 or 7 or whatever it is. In the United States, it's 600 or 700. I don't know, you can check that. It keeps changing. So the difference of less than 10 to 6 or 700, and the most important statistic, if the United States had the same number of deaths per million as China, instead of having 160,000 deaths, I don't know, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 deaths. Can you imagine that? And that's a difference in performance. So, and I think the question therefore is, why is China doing so well? And this is, of course, the other major part of my book, is that China has developed, in some ways, the most meritocratic government in the world. So the quality of mind of people in making public policies and implementing them in China, whether it's in the health ministry or education ministry or in the agriculture ministry or in the security ministry, they're all very, very talented people. and they're able to work together, and they're able to work together with a lot of discipline. And that's something that people don't seem to notice. That why I mentioned the Harvard Kennedy School study that showed how support for the Chinese Communist Party is going up. Why is the support going up? The support is going up because people's lives have improved significantly as a result of what the Chinese Communist Party has done. So in some ways, what COVID-19 clearly shows that when it comes to competence in governance, okay, there's no question that China is now one of the most competent governments in the world. And sadly, in the case of the United States, since Ronald Reagan famously said, government is not the solution, government is the problem, there's been a delegitimization, defunding, demoralization of even very good agencies in the United States, like Federal Aviation Administration, the Food and Drug Administration, the Center for Disease Prevention and Control. These are world-class agencies that everyone looked up to in the past, and look at where they are now. That's what happens when you, fortunately, Europe doesn't do this, by the way. Europe certainly doesn't delegitimize, defund, demoralize government, but the United States has done that, and the United States is paying a price for that. And that also becomes a factor in the competition between US and China.
America's top economic diplomat, Keith Krach, said yesterday, I've had an interview with him, and he told me, I understand that the world wants America to take the lead and to protect the democratic values of the American dream, because America remains a beacon of hope and light throughout the world. The goal is to isolate China's digital economy. And so last week, the State Department announced 5 new initiatives for a clean network: clean carrier, clean app, clean store, clean cable, and clean cloud. Now, as many nations as possible, they want to join. Do you see a paradigm shift of US policy away from America first and back to partnership and world leadership?
Well, I think the whole world would be very happy if America were to once again become a beacon for the world. And America was a beacon for the world. Let me emphasize that, okay? If you look back, and especially for someone of my generation, you know, I was born in 1948 and I grew up in the 1950s, 1960s. And I remember John F. Kennedy. And, you know, as a child growing up in Singapore, I would watch the black and white television set and see the American houses, suburban homes with 2-car garages, and, you know, everyone happy families. So it's amazing, you know, America was truly a beacon for the world. And I think I would be very happy if America once again became a beacon for the world. But as you know, I have a chapter in my book called The Assumption of Virtue. And America assumes that by definition, it is a more virtuous society. But as you know, I quote a Harvard professor, Steve Wald, who says, oh, Americans believe we are the shining city on the hill, we're doing everything right, and we are wonderful. Then he concludes by saying, unfortunately, none of this is true. And we are dealing now with a far more intelligent world, you know, far more intelligent world, much more thoughtful. And to have the president of the world's most powerful country ignore basic science and refuse to wear a mask. It's crazy. How many lives would have been saved if the president had just worn a mask? If people had followed him then. That's what presidents are supposed to do. And I can tell you, just today, I did another webinar like this with a former Minister of Trade of Indonesia, Mari Pangestu, the Dean of the Medical School in University of Malaya, a lady, Professor Adiba. And she's an expert on HIV/AIDS, you know, expert on that, it's her field. And she says, you know, in HIV/AIDS, if you really want to prevent it, you've got to insist that people wear condoms. And she said, today, with COVID-19, you've got to insist they wear masks. So see your mask as your condom. So it's essential, it's critical, it's life-saving. You know what it's like, right? Without a condom, what happens to you, right? So that's what a mask does. And it's so basic, so basic. So all the leaders, our leaders everywhere, every country in the world, including China, they're wearing masks. So how can you become a beacon of the world? How can? And at the end of the day, you cannot assume. You see, the sad part about the United States, I think all of us are great admirers of the United States. America built up a stock of political capital for a long time, right? But that stock of political capital, Americans is being drained, you know, after the Iraq War, which is completely unnecessary. I mean, America wasted $3 trillion. And frankly, as I say, America has spent $5 trillion fighting post 9/11 wars, right? At a time when the average income of the bottom 50% in America has gone down over a 30-year period. If you had taken that $5 trillion, not spent it on bombing Islamic countries, and given a check to the every citizen in the bottom 50% in America, each citizen in the bottom 50% would have got a check for $30,000. At a time when Americans don't have $400 to $500 in emergency cash. I mean, Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager, has said this. So, you know, the data shows that something has gone seriously wrong in the United States of America. So as a friend of the United States, I'm telling my American friends, hey, number one, if you really want to be a beacon of the world, first fix your own problems, because we live in a world where we can see it immediately. I mean, you have Americans criticizing Hong Kong police for their treatment of demonstrators in Hong Kong. Not one person died in Hong Kong. In the United States, hundreds died. The police was so brutal, right? And so how do you criticize other countries? So, you know, I wish, I would very much like America to become a beacon of the world, but to become a beacon of the world, it's not the words that you use that matter. Yeah. It's how and how you take care of your own society. And, you know, George Kennan, the man who formulated America's containment strategy against the Soviet Union, said, at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest between the United States and Soviet Union will depend not on who's got the bigger military, who's got more bullets and bombs. He says it will depend on the spiritual vitality of each society. Is Soviet Union more vital, has got more spiritual vitality, or does the United States have more spiritual vitality? And the reason why the United States won the geopolitical contest against the Soviet Union is because it had greater spiritual vitality. It was far more attractive as a society than the Soviet Union was. But today, if you look at data, if you want social science data, and you look at concrete indicators, right? Life expectancy, infant mortality, right? Access to education, number of people who get incarcerated, all these data, Chinese society is performing better in these areas than United States is. And that's why a Stanford University psychologist, whom I quote in my book, says, actually, if you want to see spiritual vitality, go to China today. Now, that's something that most Americans are not aware of, which is sad.
Kishore, what is the strategic goal of China? Where does China want to go?
Well, I think number one, I know many Americans are afraid that China is going to export communism to the world. And this is actually what Secretary of State Pompeo said in his Nixon Library speech. I'm sure you've all read the Nixon Library speech, where he says China is going to come and spread communism. I can assure you one thing. The Chinese have no desire to export communism to the world at all. Zero. And this stopped, by the way, 40 years ago when Deng Xiaoping came to Singapore and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, the then Prime Minister of Singapore, said to Mr. Deng Xiaoping, how can we become friends if you're supporting a communist party that is going to overthrow my government? So quietly after that, Deng Xiaoping stopped all the support. And for 40 years, China has stopped supporting communist parties in Southeast Asia. So what is this communist bogeyman that America is bringing up? It's not true. And I can tell you what, there's only one major strategic goal that the Chinese have. And this, I have to go back to my century of humiliation. The Chinese want to make sure that they're never humiliated again. That they'll never again have British and French forces destroy the Summer Palace in 1860. No, we were shocked when the Taliban destroyed 2 statues in Afghanistan. What the British and French forces did in the Summer Palace in 1860, you know, remember the burning of Notre Dame? They burned down 1,000 Notre Dames. 1,000. They were worse than the Taliban. The Chinese have, you have forgotten it. I mean, sorry, British, French have forgotten it. Chinese remember it very well. So they want to make sure it never happens again. So how do you make sure it doesn't happen again? You become strong. So the Chinese goal is to ensure that Chinese civilization is once again treated as one of the most respected civilizations in the world. So, and unlike the United States, which believes that anybody can become American, right? Anybody. The Chinese actually will be very surprised if others said, oh, can I become Chinese? They said, no. You remain German, you remain Indian, I'm Chinese. You make your civilization strong, I make, the Chinese believe in, they're not going to try and dominate the world in the sense of trying to make you become Chinese. They have no such desire whatsoever. So that's why it's a big mistake in the United States. They take all the conceptual paraphernalia from the first Cold War, which was very good. It worked very well in the Cold War against Germany, but it doesn't apply at all to China. And so it's a big mistake to use the Cold War analogies because you're dealing with a very, very different competitor.
So we are curious in Europe, what role can Europe play in this conflict? Many dream of Europe playing a neutral role. Volkswagen, Daimler, BMW sell cars to the US and China. Is a neutral role possible, or do we have to decide?
Well, I think the whole world would love Europe to play a greater leadership role today. See, I'm quite serious, okay? And I'm dead serious, because if you look at it in terms of economic weight, okay, there are only 3 economic heavyweight elephants in the room, okay? In terms, I mean, India has got a population, but India's GNP is nothing, you know, compared to what US, Europe, and China. These are the 3 big economic elephants in the room. And if US and China are having this contest, which as I explained in my book, will carry on for the next 10 to 20 years, we would like a third party to come in and play, hopefully, a stabilizing role, a balancing role, and only Europe can do it. And frankly, everybody will be, and the reason why Europe will be welcome is because you're not a threat. Right? You don't have great military forces. You're not out to conquer the world, right? So precisely because you're weak and non-threatening, you are actually a wonderful third player you can have. And there's a tremendous opportunity for Europe to play an independent role. And I would also argue, as I do in my book, I have a section on Europe, as you know, that from Europe's point of view, your number 1 threat today is no more Russian tanks. Russian tanks are not going to come into Germany or anywhere. They're not going to come, full stop. Your biggest threat, which is distorted European politics, is migration. And Africa's population, which in 1950 was half of Europe, today is more than double Europe. By 2100, it will be 10 times the size of Europe. So African development is a key strategic priority for Europe. Who's going to be your best partner for development of Africa is China. China is investing more in Africa than anybody else is. So Europe can take advantage of its position where it can work with the United States, work with China, and then try to achieve a more stable and rational relationship within the two. There is a leadership opportunity for Europe, but unfortunately, you know this better than I do, it won't happen because you're so obsessed with your internal issues, you're wasting your time on Brexit. Now you're discussing how much money you should give to Greece, how much money you should give to Italy, and you spend hours and hours negotiating formulas about that. And so, while you're busy doing that, the whole world is changing and transforming itself. So I don't understand how, I would say if you look at the time, the mindset of the time of European leaders, whatever it is, 50, 60% domestic, 30% Europe, and then maybe 10% for the rest of the world. But it's the rest of the world that actually is going to influence Europe dramatically. So you've got to figure out a way of creating more strategic discipline among the leaders of Europe. And they should spend at least 20 to 30% of the time thinking about what's happening in the rest of the world, especially what's happening between US and China, and what they can do to try and keep that relationship, not let the relationship get out of control. So there is a tremendous leadership opportunity for Europe, but I hope that you will find a European leader who will stand up to do that.
Brigitte, do you think it's possible that we have another role in the future than we have had in the past?
You mean Europe has another role, or what
Maybe
do you mean?
Germany too. You know Angela Merkel very well. You work with her together for years and years. Do you think that we have the mindset for the future that we are something more than a leader than before?
It's difficult to say, because what you mentioned is quite right. Europe has a lot to do with itself. So the question of taking up a leadership always means we are together and we want to go forward. And this is a difficulty in Europe in these days, as you just rightly mentioned, in my opinion. Yeah.
I would like to ask somebody from the German, industry, the German, Paul, can you give us some insights? Some insights. How do you see the situation right now with Europe and the US and China? Do you like to give us one?
Actually, I'd like to ask a question, a fundamental question to Kishore, rather than quote unquote pretending that I have some insights. The fundamental question that we have in this whole discussion is China expansionist or not? Because the way that you can describe it, so you make a number of points in your book. So one of the theories that people have always had, and I have had, was that China is focused on just keeping stability inside China, and whatever they do, that's their main preoccupation. Therefore, they have no real desire to be expansionist, and in a 4,000-year history, they've never been really expansionist. You also make the point that we should be very careful about asking for democracy in China, because it may be a very aggressive nationalistic democracy if it ever happened. You also make the very good point of don't get too excited about the South China Sea. Just think about what the Americans, Teddy Roosevelt sends his greetings, has done in terms of Monroe Doctrine and the near above of the US. So if I, for a second, say China is actually not expansionist, then we don't have anything to worry about except for a economic type of competition that we all should actually be very well positioned to actually go for. But if that assumption is not true, we've got a much more fundamental problem, and that's of course the argument that the Americans are right now advancing. And if that's the case, there's probably no real way for neutrality and a third place. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can shed some light on that, because it seems to me that that's the fundamental question we need to get our mind around.
Paul, that's a very good question. I can see you read my book carefully already. Number one, you're right. I do talk about 2,000 years of Chinese history. And if the Chinese were expansionists, Australia should be full of Chinese people. And by the way, Australia did have some Chinese ships that visited Australia before the British came. But stupidly, the Chinese never went there. And so the British came all the way halfway across the world and took over Australia. That's exhibit A of non-expansionism. But of course, this doesn't mean that while China, as you know, tries to avoid wars, Chinese influence will grow. significantly influence, and as a result of its economy and so on and so forth. And so when you say China is not going to be expansionist in the sense that it is not going out to conquer territories outside, Chinese influence will expand. And you know, in geopolitics, it's a zero-sum game. It's not like economics, you know. In economics, you can have two companies doing very well, both growing beautifully, and you know, one growth is not the expense of other. But geopolitical influence is a zero-sum game. So for example, I'll give you a concrete example, okay? Thailand is a treaty ally of the United States of America. Still is a treaty ally of the United States of America. If you had gone to Thailand in the 60s or 70s, the American ambassador was up here, the Chinese ambassador, like number 50, number 60 in the totem pole, right? And you know, in some ways, ambassadors reflect the level of influence of the country. Today, you go to Bangkok, treaty ally of the United States, the Chinese ambassador is number 1. The American ambassador, 3 or 4. So the Americans can feel it. Of course they can feel it. So that is, at the end of the day, the strategic dilemma that the US has to face. And as you know, in my book, as I say, what the US government needs to do, strategic decision the United States government needs to make is what is more important for long-term American interests? Is it the well-being of its people or the primacy of its geopolitical influence? So and there's no doubt the reason why the United States has launched this contest, which in some ways is rational, its primacy is diminishing. It will diminish as Chinese influence becomes stronger. The capacity of the United States to unilaterally force countries to do things that the United States wanted it to be done. And I must emphasize, let me make this very clear. United States overall has been, relatively speaking, a very benign hegemon. Maybe except in Central America, or if you happen to be too close to the United States, you may have problems. But in Southeast Asia, the United States has been incredibly benign, and there are huge reservoirs of goodwill for the United States in Southeast Asia. And I keep reminding my American friends, you know, Southeast Asia is a place you should come and engage. But no Southeast Asian country wants to end up in a collision course with China. They want a more intelligent relationship between US and China. So to answer your question directly, Paul, the Chinese are not expansionists in the sense that they will not try to establish naval bases around the world and try and build up alliances around the world. That's not what their goal is. Their primary goal is to make sure that China is strong and respected. To make China strong and respected, they're going to have a global footprint and develop links with the whole world and so on and so forth. But as a result of doing that, the American influence in the world, which used to be overwhelming, right? 70 to 80% of geopolitical space in the world. And America truly, especially as recently as the 1990s, was a unipolar world. And Hubert Védrine said it's a hyperpuissance, right? Now, United States is no longer hyperpuissance, you know, it's gone. So, you know, United States has moved from a bipolar world during the Cold War to a unipolar world. And unfortunately, as you know, got intoxicated by the end of history argument and thought, oh, the United States can sit back and relax. The rest of the world is all going to become like America. We can just sit back and relax. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And it is a multipolar world that is emerging. The Chinese feel very comfortable in a multipolar world, very comfortable. They don't need a unipolar world. But for the United States, a multipolar world as of now is a nightmare. But actually, if the United States focuses on improving the well-being of its people, if it is no longer the #1 ambassador in Thailand, so what? Who cares? Okay, you're #3 in Thailand, so what? My people are not worse off, right? But that requires a psychological adjustment on the part of the leaders of the United States. And at the end of the day, really, the amount of influence the United States has had over 100 years by one country is unusual. It's abnormal. We're now going to a normal world. That's all. a normal world, you have many successful powers, many successful civilizations. And one of my key arguments is that we should celebrate the renaissance of the Chinese civilization, because the Chinese civilization has been one of the highest performing civilizations in human history. So when there's a renaissance of Chinese civilization, we should celebrate it. But of course, we've got to make space for it, right? I got to make space for it. I use a very simple analogy. When I began this conversation with you, there was a little cat in the room, okay? I was very happy for the pussy cat in the room. After talking to you for 40 minutes, I turned around, oh, the cat has become a tiger. Oh, now surely I behave differently, right?
Yeah.
Surely I have to change my behavior. The pussy cat has become a tiger. And that's what China has become. In PPP terms, China's GNP in 1980 was 10% of United States, 10%. Today it's bigger. And you're saying, I don't have to adjust? Surely you have to adjust. We all have to adjust. But what's wrong with adjusting and adapting? Right? But if you insist that you will not change or adapt your behavior, and that at the end of the day is, the goal of my book is to say, hey, you can adapt and adjust intelligently to this new China. And also one important point before I forget, the Western project to create a rules-based global order is not dead. China is still in favor of it, as of now. But we only have a window of opportunity. And this is the time to work with China to try and strengthen that rules-based order. Unfortunately, the United States is destroying it, walking away from the World Health Organization, refusing to ratify the Convention, the Law of the Sea, and so on and so forth. We should, and this is where Europe can play a role, to continue to strengthen the rules-based order while China is still in favor of it. And I'm going to, I'm glad, Paul, you mentioned about democracy in China. I can tell you one thing. I have absolutely no doubt that a democratic elected Chinese leader will be far more nationalist than Xi Jinping. And I'll give you two leading indicators, okay, of two politicians who always win their elections in their countries. One is Erdogan in Turkey, and the other is Modi in India. What do you get when you get a democratically elected leader? He takes Hagia Sophia, that beautiful place that you and I have been to. It's now a mosque, because that's what nationalism does to you. There's a mosque in Ayodhya was burned down. What does Modi do? Build a Hindu temple there. And in 2042, if you have a democratically elected leader in China, he will tell the British, now is the time for you to pay reparations for the Opium War of 1842.
Okay, that's a bold, bold question. That was great. That was really great, because now we have 50 minutes we are on, and maybe a last question from the audience, from my editor, Brigitte. You have a last question? We have learned a lot today, huh? About China, about Europe, and
I have a question.
Yes, we did.
Mr. Eberhard, yeah. Mr. Eberhard.
I have a question that was very, very interesting. I have the experience. I lived in the US for a couple of years, and I'm in the last years very often in China. So really, it's a topic which we have to take care. It's essential for us, for Germany, for Europe, also for the European economy. And I have a question. When you talk to the Chinese young people, they very often mention something like humiliation they have had in the past. And I got that when I was walking at the Bund in Shanghai, and said, look, this very nice buildings on the right side. And the young lady said, look to Pudong. That's the new China. And then I said, can you explain me a little bit more? And it was clear that they said, we want to get out of that situation where other forces told us what we have to do, And this is so deep linked in the society, and even the young people. I was really surprised. It was a young lady of 28, 29, very good educated, and told me, look, this is the key. We want to be independent. We want to work with you, but not on the same level and not to be under the pressure. We were, you mentioned it from UK, nothing against UK. I like them, you know. Everybody has a history, not always nice. But this is the key, and that's also maybe explains why they want to be more independent technology-wise, not to be, under pressure to buy the very expensive cars from Germany, the high-tech machines from Europe. Yes, we could do that with the free choice. And that's my question to you, Kishore. What do you think about that humiliation stuff?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm glad you mentioned young people, because the young people are indicators of what the future of China is going to be. And I'm glad you told the story about the young lady. And I'll tell you two stories of young people. One was carried in the Financial Times, and by the journalist is Jamil Andalini. And you can Google and find that story in the Financial Times. He said he was walking in some village in China, and he met a 10-year-old boy. And the 10-year-old boy looked very troubled, you know, and asked him, he said, "You're from Europe?" He says, "Yes." He says, this 10-year-old boy asked this Financial Times correspondent, "Why did you burn down our summer palace in 1860? 10-year-old boy. That was 5 years ago. So 40 years from now, he'll be 55. Why did you burn down the summer palace in 1860? So these issues are real. The second story, and I tell this in my book, I had a research assistant in Columbia University. Columbia University, I'm part of my sabbatical. They assigned a very bright young Chinese lady doing masters in Columbia University. So I was one day chatting with her. So talking about her life, and so I asked her, "How was your life in China?" She said, "It was very good. I had a good schooling and everything." She said, I was only sad because I graduated number 2 from my high school." So I said, "Number 2 from your high school? That's very good. Excellent." She said, No, you don't understand." I said, "What did I not understand?" He says, "In China, if you are a young person and your dream is to join the Chinese Communist Party, you can only join if you're number 1. My dream at the age of 16, I didn't succeed." And you know, people keep saying, "How come? Why is the Chinese party? Why isn't the Chinese Communist Party collapsing?" Actually, it carries a lot of hopes and aspirations to people. And she said, "By the way, finally I got to the university and I became the top student my first year, and I managed to get into the Chinese Communist Party." So when people keep thinking the Chinese Communist Party is going to disintegrate and disappear, they don't understand how it has become an essential part of the identity of the Chinese. And at the same time, I also want to emphasize that the word communist is so misleading, because at the end of the day, the goal of the Chinese Communist Party is not to spread global communism, but to strengthen Chinese civilization. So I've always recommended that they change the name CCP from Chinese Communist Party to Chinese Civilization Party. Then you'll understand what its real goals are. That's the core and the heart. And I can tell you, when Mao Zedong, you remember the famous day in 1949 when the People's Republic of China was established? What did he say? He didn't say communism has won in China. No, he didn't say that. Mao, he says China has stood up. China has stood up. He said it twice. So their goal is to strengthen China. And that will carry on. And I think then, frankly, I think Europe can work with China.
Kishore, last question, only for 1 minute. Give us some hope for Europe in 1 minute.
Well, I would say that, you know, if you are an objective person and you're trying to assess which are the best societies in the world in terms of finding the right balance, you know what I mean, have prosperity and yet take care of your bottom 10%, bottom 20%. And in the old days, the automatic assumption was that the best society, of course, would be American society, the model of the world. Today, increasingly, I would say, especially the Northern European societies, including Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, these are now considered the model societies for the world. So I think the European model of finding the right balance between capitalism and also welfare, that I think is going to become the model for the world in the 21st century. So you are actually in some ways, and it's good that you're not trying to market yourself, because the less you market yourself, the more you're marketing yourself and you're becoming the beacon of the world.
Thank you very much. That was great. It was, thank you very much for joining us in Germany in our DUB Business Talk. And thank you very much to the audience and that you have joined us.